Good evening, everyone. Ram Rahman's profile photograph on Facebook says the real Ram Rahman, and the only person who can introduce the real Ram Rahman is Ram Rahman himself. So, without further delay, I would like to invite Ram Rahman, the photographer, the curator, the activist, the historian, and a teacher to many young photographers like me, onto the stage.
Well, if I may just spice it up, Ram has spoken in both the first edition and the second edition of the Delhi Photo Festival. But his gripe, and rightly so, was the fact that we asked him to speak about others' work and not his. And I hope Ram's going to be speaking about his own work this time.
First of all, thanks Dinesh, thanks Prashant for having set this festival up all those years ago. And it's quite an amazing thing that they've done. And I mean, just look at it here today. And I know that this year they've had a lot of problems money-wise. And I'm not one of the people who crowdfunded, but maybe in 2 years I'll have some money. And we can have a major funding from my side. That's
We will remind you.
yeah. And as he said, you know, the last 2 times I've actually spoken have been on, well, both I think were photographers who are no longer alive. And I'm fairly good at speaking on other people's work. Speaking on your own work is extremely difficult. And also 2 days ago, the Delhi pollution got to me, so I'm full of crocin, Benadryl, and other antihistamines right now, so it might be a bit shaky. I thought the best thing that I could do is actually just give you a story of how I ended up doing what I do, because a lot of young people here are coming from a very different situation, very different generation, very different India, very different economy. So I'm going to start, as other people have done before, grandparents, parents, etc. These are my parents. This is New York, 1945. My father and mother. Father's 30 years old, mother 15. She eloped from high school. Father was an architect. He had just graduated from architecture in MIT. He's one of the first Indians to study architecture in the US. And my mother was daughter of a very famous dancer who was American but had become an Indian in her own mind and in her own life, and had become a very well-known Indian dancer. That's my dad when he came back to Calcutta. He had got a West Bengal state scholarship to go to the US. And he was a very keen photographer. This is a photograph he set up and took of himself with his model of the new Secretariat building in Calcutta, which was the first tall steel structure in India. That's his photograph of my mother, who had studied Bharatanatyam in the south, in Tanjore and in Madras. So the atmosphere that me and my sister's here too today, we grew up with an architect, modern architect father and a classical dancer mother. So we were in a milieu of the arts as children. My father moved to Delhi because of Jawaharlal Nehru, who brought him here when the city was being built. And our history is really tied into the building of this new city through the 1950s, 1960s. And I think that journey is something that we are still on and continuing with. This is in Rashtrapati Bhavan. That's my mother on the left, Roshan Vajifdar in the middle, Yamini Krishnamurthy next to Jawaharlal Nehru. And that's 1961, my father with Nehru, showing him the plans of Rabindra Bhavan. Interestingly, both the protests which have been happening in the last 2 weeks at the Sahitya Academy, which is at the Rabindra Bhavan, and the University Grants Commission at ITO, where the students are protesting the cuts of the scholarships, are both my dad's buildings. And it's interesting that those institutions set up in the 1950s and 1960s are now the site of this whole upheaval that we're going through. And that's one reason I really wanted to talk about this Nehruvian connection, because that's what is being demolished right now. And we are really children of that period and children of that ethos. That's the Rabindra Bhavan, in which Jawaharlal Nehru actually had a direct hand in design. This is Curzon Road Hostels. A lot of New Delhi, a lot of the new city that was coming up, the infrastructure was designed by my father. He worked for the PWD. And this was the whole, father was a student of Walter Gropius, had brought this whole aesthetic of the Bauhaus, functionality, simplified modernism to Delhi. And remember, these buildings are being built when there wasn't a lot of money, so they're fairly cheaply built. But they still filled with a kind of idealism of the new India which was being created in many, many fields. That's a photograph of the ICCR alcove, that was designed by Kanvinde, who was 5 years junior to my father in Harvard, also a student of Walter Gropius, and in the back is my father's Indraprastha Bhavan. Dad was a very talented architectural photographer, actually. And I'm going to bring out some of that work maybe in January. This is the Indraprastha Bhavan, Ring Road. And that's my father with Joseph Stein, the other great architect who did the Habitat Center where the festival used to be, India International Center, Triveni, and that's me, at the zoo, which my father designed. We grew up in a house full of artists, musicians, actors, dancers. Delhi was very small in those days. This is a picture at Sujan Singh Park where we lived, in the Gujral on the left. That's my mother, the only barefoot person in the picture, with me. Satish Gujral, when he was gloriously hairless. M.F. Hussain and Charles Fabry. So this is the kind of, Hussain and Gujral had been introduced to each other in our house in Sujan Singh Park. And the reason I mention the bare feet is because Hussain actually has sandals in this picture. When I was in modern school, we had a lot of art, dance, music, photography. And this is a magazine cover. I had actually studied Bharatanatyam with Kalakshetra Lalita Shastri when I was young, and went touring in Russia and landed up on the cover of this magazine. And this is something that I think Pablo still wakes up sweating, because he wrote a piece on me in Platform magazine, mentioning this with great disdain almost, saying that he really thinks a lot of himself because he was on the cover of that magazine. Pablo was in school with me before he was thrown out. This made him even more jealous. This is the inside of the same magazine. And that's Pablo on the right, when he was a theater actor. We were all in Ruchika theater group together. One of the important parts of our lives in modern school is that all the artists' children were in modern school. Because M.N. Kapoor, who was the principal, I think you missed some of that. Yeah, I'll show the porno pictures a little later. But M.N. Kapoor had actually gathered all the artists' children in the school because he thought that that would help the other kids become a little more creative. So the Alkazi children were there, the Bartholomew children were there, Tayyab Mehta's kids were there, Krishan Khanna's kids were there, I was there, Amjad Ali Khan was there, Madhup Mudgal, classical musicians. Everyone was in the school, and we were all roughly, Amjad is a little older, but roughly the same age. Now, I grew up in the house which was actually filled with photography. My mother was photographed by a number of photographers. This is a picture by Ahmad Ali from Calcutta, who's still alive, 94, I think, or 95 years old now. My grandmother, photographed by Shunil Jana, also by Jana, my grandma. My mother, by Jana. It's also Sunil Jana. Also Jana. This is unusual because this is by Kishore Parekh, and the kind of photograph that has not really been seen too much. And this is me by Kishore Parekh, 1966. And I'd like to, I don't know if Swapan is here, but thank Swapan for the amazing resurrection of Kishore's Bangladesh book, which is in the gallery next door, something that we've all been hounding him about for years. And this is also Kishore. This is a whole other side of Kishore Parekh. There's a whole bunch of vintage prints in the cupboard at home, which someday will come out. This is, I actually got interested in all these people much later. I'll talk a little bit about that. This is Ahmad Ali, 2 years ago, with me. We got him to do a talk. This is T.S. Nagarajan, before he died, I think about 2 years ago in Bangalore, who also was very close to the family. And that's my picture of T.S. Satyan, all of whom had photographed. So in a funny way, I knew these people, but I got to know them again much later because I began to appreciate who they were and what their work was about. I followed my father to MIT in the 1970s to study physics. And that's me in the front, by the way, in the glasses and the jola. That's on the Chieftain offset press, which was in the design studio. MIT was quite a mad place and had a huge impact on me. A curious part of my photo history, it was in MIT that I got interested in photography, because I started doing some photo classes. Incredible photo lab, which had been set up by Minor White. But I'm going to show you a notebook that I just pulled out 2 days ago. This was my strobe project lab with Harold Edgerton, the great scientist who invented the strobe in MIT. Pablo, sometimes it helps to have an education. That's the notebook, and those are my pictures of the milk drop, which generations of students there have done. So I did study a little bit. You must all have seen the famous Edgerton pictures of the milk drop. But this was, sitting in the lab. It was an amazing experience working with this man who was like a 13-year-old. And my mother never forgot him, because when she walked into the lab one day, he asked me if that was my girlfriend. And he used to walk around with these pictures, postcards of these in his pocket in the corridors of MIT. And because he was so famous, he would hand them out to everyone, as gifts. That's the bullet going through the milk carton and through the cigarette. And you see, I got a very good grade in this class. After that, I went to Yale to do graphic design, actually, because I didn't know what I would do after MIT, where I'd got a degree called a Bachelor of Science in Art and Design, because physics had gone through the door. I had done art history, Indian art history at Harvard, photography history at Wellesley. I mean, MIT kind of opened all kinds of windows, and that's where my interest in photography really started. But this was Yale, and I hated Yale. And this was the beginning of this construction around my desk, which became a kind of dissident construction. This photograph was taken by Philip Lorca de Corsia, who was a fellow student in photography, and PL has become one of the most famous American photographers now. And that was my graduation at Yale, which was not very traditional and caused quite an uproar. But I did get my degree. And I moved to New York and built this loft. That's my room in the back. And that's Lee and Maria Friedlander and Lois Connor, photographer. And actually that's a Halloween party, which is why she's dressed like a Native American. This is a place I had for 28 years. I had built a darkroom, except I was coming back and forth to Delhi for all those years. And I didn't know, how to earn a living at that time because I was not a press photographer, I was not a journalist. But because of my architecture connections, architects started asking me to photograph their buildings. And as I got more serious about that, I had to go and buy a view camera, which is my little field Sinar. And this is still the work that I do, and it's the only work I do which earns me some money through photography. This is my own pictures of my father's Sheila cinema, which has been beautifully preserved in Paharganj. It was built in 1961. So that's my earning work. This is IMP's Museum of Islamic Art in Doha. And this is what I'm shooting now, which is the Rashtrapati Bhavan. But at the same time, in the 70s, once I got interested in the US, and the reason I got interested in all those photographers who I knew as a child, or rather, they who knew me as a child, was because I got exposed to the history of photography in the US, and I began to realize that we didn't have a written history in India, and I'd never been exposed to something like a history of photography. And I began to realize that all these people that I knew who were in and out of my house were actually people who had done remarkable work, very important bodies of work. And I started following that as I grew up later on. But this was the kind of 35 millimeter work that I was doing. And it was PL, actually, Philip Lorca de Corsia, who was looking at my work and persuaded me to shift to a 120 camera. And I used a Plaubel Machina, which was a folding rangefinder, which had a fixed lens, 6x7. And I think the reason he wanted me to shift to that was because he sold me his camera and was buying a bigger one. But the camera actually totally transformed my practice, because working with a fixed lens, slightly formal, it was very compact. You couldn't do very fancy things with it. You could just make an image. A time of limited film, didn't have a lot of money, so you really had to think about the image. As a student in MIT, I'd got very, romantically obsessed. Not romantically, but I thought it was very romantic to see the work of Edward Weston, etc. And of course, I was making the same kind of work, shooting, drain pipes, bits, vegetables, peppers. But I had gone up to photograph with Romy Khosla, the architecture of Malana, this village in Himachal. And this woman came up to me and asked me to make her portrait, and I was very nervous because anyway that village was very edgy about outsiders. But she forced me to make this picture, and I made this one frame, and when I developed it in my bathroom in Delhi, I had all my film developing tanks, etc., and made a small print, I was completely struck. And I thought of this picture. This is a close-up. I thought of this picture of Walker Evans. This is Annie Mae Burroughs, shot in Alabama during the 1930s. And I have, of course, seen Evans's work. I had been in Yale. He had just died. He had been teaching in Yale, but had died the year before I went there. So there was this whole, ethos and culture about Evans. And I thought that his work was very boring and very dull at the time. But it's this picture and this that suddenly made me look at his work again. And it completely changed my understanding of the simplicity of his pictures, the directness, and how a picture like that could be filled with stories, with histories, with a real looking. If you looked really, really carefully and looked hard, I realized that there's an intensity of looking in his work, which, influenced me in the sense that it opened up different doors for me. I'm going to go through some images fairly quickly. That's Hyderabad. Very interested in our kind of pop culture, our street culture, and I looked at it as a kind of found art or a made art, a people's art, sometimes which happened serendipitously, but a lot of humor, a lot of fun, a lot of wit, a lot of politics. Francis Bacon in Kerala. I don't know who would go to that tailor after seeing that sign to get their clothes done. That's also Kerala, obviously. That actually was right around the corner, I think. This is Arjun Singh, when he was not in great favor. I think this was Narasimha Rao who came at night and pulled that head down. And that's not Bhagat Singh, but it's Bobby Deol as Bhagat Singh. I love these little ironies that one finds. That's Jawaharlal. Vajpayee. Because of my connection with the arts, I knew a lot of the artists, and I have worked with the different generations of them. This is Bhupen Kakkar, who I got to know rather well. This is here in Delhi at the Gandhi Darshan. I have slightly more wicked pictures of this session, which someday I shall bring out. That's Francis Souza. That's in New York, in Souza's flat. Rekha Rodwitia. This is a picture that launched 1,000 hearts. Rumana Hussain, who very sadly died of cancer, breast cancer. Hugely, hugely talented artist and a very dear friend. So in many ways, I realized that what I was doing was making pictures around my own life, my own milieu. I wasn't running out looking for subjects. I wasn't, doing press photography. And I realized that in some ways what I was doing was becoming a kind of diaristic document of our times, of our city, of our culture. This was Devyani Krishna, the great artist who was our teacher in modern school. Pictures I pulled out remembering Shamshad Hussain, who's there in the middle, who'd passed away last week. And that's something that happens with these photographs, because as people depart, the picture takes on a completely different meaning. And that's Krishan Khanna and Shamshad. Shamshad in his father's flat in Dubai. And that's Paramjit Singh, Neelima, Sheikh, and Shamshad in Vivan Sundaram's house a number of years ago. And that's Hussain painting a horse. Now, you saw that early picture of my father who'd done a picture of Hussain. So in some ways, that journey continues and those connections continued. Ruth Chhabwala and Cyrus Chhabwala both have now passed away. Ruth, of course, the writer, and Cyrus, who was an architect colleague of my father's. And that's Raghubir Singh, who I think last time at the festival I had done a long talk on Raghubir and his work, which is somebody that I was quite close to, very close to. This is in Goa. That's Mario Miranda and Charles Correa working on a project with Mario was doing some murals for Charles. I'd photographed a lot of Charles's architectural work, but we had become very close. He, of course, knew my father from the 50s. Habib Tanveer and Monica Tanveer. Habib Tanveer, the great theater director. All of these people are actually people that I've worked with. I've had the privilege of working with, including Mr. Paswan and Phulan Devi. This was actually the first day that he introduced me to Phulan Devi. I do not work with Mr. Paswan now, let me clarify. That's him in his house. Shubha Mudgal, and singing for a ailing Kaifi Azmi. And that's Vidya Shah, who's become a superstar in her own right now. But this is something, I still find the documentary photograph, the document, to me, is still fascinating. Because I think the stories that we have are wonderful, are rich. The people that we have are very interesting. Their stories are very interesting. So I'm endlessly fascinated by the document. And I've never felt the need to go into a slightly more expressive, aspect of photography. These are socialite friends in Delhi. Costume party. I love the theater of the city. That's Ashok Nehru dressed as his uncle, Jawaharlal Nehru. That's Lalit Nirula, who started Nirulas, in the middle as Karunanidhi. And that's Bernard Imhasli as Ottavio Quattrocchi, who's defined by label on his pocket. Ordinary dinner party in Delhi. Naveen Patnaik on the corner there has, of course, been the chief minister of Orissa for a number of years now. But this was in an earlier avatar. That's Jairam Ramesh's bald head in the foreground. And that was Unni Krishnan in the cocktail party. This is Unni Krishnan on the podium in front of Red Fort at a political meeting. I.K. Gujral, when he first ran for parliament, this is in Jalandhar, the same Gujral who was in that picture with me as a kid. And Sitaram Yechuri, Manmohan Singh. Bala Saraswati, her daughter Lakshmi. This is my art connection, my dance connection. coming through, and that's Aniruddha, who's Lakshmi and Bala have both died. Aniruddha has taken on the mantle and has become a very interesting Bharatanatyam dancer himself in Madras. These are two great Chow gurus in Seraikela. Terrific Ardhanarishwara. This was a group which had come of Bhavai actors from Gujarat. The most moving Ardhanarishwara that I've ever seen. This is all the Bhavai group. This is something that my parents instilled in me, actually, the terrific respect for actors, performers of whatever class or craft. It didn't matter to them. The performer was the greatest human being on earth, and that's something that we imbibed, and I still carry that through. These are not in drag. These are actors who specialize in female roles. Few portraits, something that I'm fascinated by. Almost all of these are people that actually I know quite well, or knew quite well. That's my Nariyalwala. This is pretty recent. This is Safdar Hashmi, his funeral in 1989. Safdar was somebody that I had worked with and I knew very well. Absolutely shocking killing, which is now, in many ways, this memory is coming back with what is happening. The three writers who've just been killed in the last year and a half. This is the exhibition, how I showed my work at Triveni a couple years ago, Bioscope. And I said, the photographers I knew as a child, this is Madan Mahata. About 3 years ago, I did an exhibition of his architectural photography. Being one myself, an architectural photographer, and knowing Madan since I was a child, I realized that the work of Madan was, not just first rate, but truly astounding work, because he documented a period of very interesting modernism in Delhi, extremely important architecture, a huge body of which happened in Delhi. Very few of us realize that we're living in a city which has actually world-class level of modernist architecture. We keep talking about heritage, but nobody realizes about that heritage. And this was done with Photo Ink Gallery and Devika Daulat Singh, another great gallery that she set up. It happened really because of her. And in many ways, this was my sharing. I mean, I was interested in this history, but I wanted to share it with a younger audience, younger architects, and we did this show, which was an absolutely amazing show. Trying to do a book. Madan passed away about a year and a half ago. A wonderful man and great, great, great photographer. And this is the show that's up just now of Shunil Jana, who's been another family connection, which you saw earlier. This is up at NGMA in Bombay. How are we doing for time? Okay. These are actually vintage prints which were discovered in a collection in Delhi. This show is up till I think the 19th or the 20th of this month. And coming back to Safdar, what happened after Safdar's death, this is another phase of my creative life, which is my activism. We set up in Safdar's memory the Safdar Hashmi Memorial Trust, which was set up by artists, actors, musicians, dancers, singers, which has now been, active for 27 years. And the main thrust of our activity has been fighting against communal politics and for the freedom of expression, but through the arts. And given the temper of what's happened in the last year, this has suddenly risen again. It's a kind of ghost that we thought we had left in the past. Public exhibitions, these are over the last many, many years. Images and words which travel to 40 cities. This was at resurrection of that at Jamia a few years ago. Shubha. I do a lot of my graphic work, which I had done, I'd studied graphic design at Yale, ended up being actually only for Sehmat. And that's all my graphics you see in the back. So it's stage designs, tent designs, posters. And here we are. This was from many years ago, Barbarians at the Gate, attacks on artists, writers, filmmakers in all these cities. And, posters are coming out again. Book cover. Fought for many years to try and get M.F. Hussain back from his exile. The shocking, at least Hussain was not killed, unlike the writers who've just been killed. But he was exiled from here, which was now many years ago. It was a shocking event then. But now would seem almost, normal, given our... This was an exhibition, Hum Sab Ayodhya, which was done right after the demolition of the Babri Masjid. This was a creative way of dealing with what had happened in Ayodhya, getting historians together, social scientists, photographers. Samar, I see sitting over there, went and did some incredible photographs of the restored ghats, which were very much part of this show. This exhibition was attacked by the BJP in 1993. We were accused, it was seized by the Delhi police from Teen Murti Bhavan here, and we were accused of criminal conspiracy against the state for making this exhibition. We fought for 8 years the case in the Delhi High Court and won with an incredible judgment, which has become a key judgment for freedom of expression in this country. This was in Pune. And that's Tista Setarwar and Romila Thapar at the exhibition, which is still showing, by the way. It's a kit exhibition, very informally mounted, which we then published as a book. And this was a big exhibition on Sehmat, which traveled in the US, has just returned for 2.5 years. This was in Chicago, in the University of Chicago. As Chandan said, I'm also curator. And I put this show together, not just the photography shows, but lots of shows for Sehmat. And this was my latest book cover, which was released yesterday, which are writings by the 3 murdered authors and philosophers. And that was the release yesterday. M.K. Raina, Krishna Sopti, 92 years old, who was lifted on stage in her wheelchair and gave the most incredibly spirited speech. And look at her fist. And that's Om Thanvi, the great journalist, editor. Now, as I said, I've never really done photojournalism, but I happened to be in Delhi when Mrs. Gandhi was assassinated. Between Bangalore and New York. And I joined a group of people to get involved in relief after the riots. Yesterday was the 31st of October, which is an anniversary of when those riots began all those years ago. This is in Kalyanpuri, where I had gone with this group of people. I had 2 rolls of Tri-X film and a Pentax. And I made these pictures, which are actually of survivors in the immediate aftermath of the violence. There's no pictures of violence. But these are actually now some of the few pictures remaining from 1984, and they get used all the time. This was the only man who was left alive in that gully. They were all auto drivers. You see all their burned autos in the back, and he had cut part of his hair off for safety. And this woman, whose name I never wrote down at the time, though I wrote down the name of her husband, whose finger she's holding in her hand, because his finger had been cut off to get his gold ring before he was burnt alive. And 2 years ago, 3 years ago, there was this big exhibition and jatha which came from the Golden Temple down to Delhi. And all the photographers who had taken photographs contributed their work to this in a call for justice and a fight for the continuing justice. As you all know, that there's been no justice for the victims of 1984. So that's my huge picture, which was blown up on the side of the truck, which drove down. And an exhibition mounted right through Punjab and here at Bangla Sahib, very informally mounted like this. And it was at this exhibition that that woman came, and I didn't meet her, but she saw that picture of herself, and there was a Hindu reporter, a reporter from the Hindu newspaper, who met her, and that's when I discovered her name, because the report came out. Her name was Nanki Devi, and I just read in the paper today that she got 5 lakhs as part of the compensation yesterday from the Delhi government, who were handing out. So it's strange how these cycles, I mean, not that 5 lakhs means anything, but and each year, this is last year, I keep getting called, these pictures sort of re-emerge as a litany almost. It's that kind of, don't let that memory go away until there's justice. This was in the Indian Express. And these are photographs of the Gulbarg Society in Gujarat. I had gone there with my friend, comrade Tista Setalwad, who's sitting here in the audience, who, as you all know, has been fighting an heroic battle for justice for those victims of killings all over Gujarat and actually in many other parts of India as well. And I had gone back to Gujarat after many years. These are the empty, burned out shells. This is actually Ehsan Jafri's house, the former senior Congress member who was burnt alive. His arms, his limbs were chopped off while he was alive in front of his wife. This is Ehsan Jafri house. And that's, oh gosh, Tista, his name? Salim Sandhi, who's standing in the room where his son was killed. I mean, to go into these spaces with these people and listen to their stories is almost unreal. And this is Ehsan Jafri's son, and Zakia Jafri, his wife. And this is a case in which Narendra Modi is named as the first accused, which is a case which is still going on, which is why Tista is being hounded on many cases being lodged against her. This was the 10th anniversary of the massacre, and I didn't know what I would do with these photographs, but I finally ended up putting these pictures of the ruins. This was in Open magazine. So, these are pictures that I have tried to get out into the public. And I combined them with the pictures that I had done many years ago when we had brought many of the survivors and the witnesses and activists to Delhi. And I had done these very straight portraits, and again, I didn't know what I would ever do with them, but I documented all these people. And when I went to Gulbarg, I put this feature in Open, combining these images. And on the 10th anniversary, I made small prints in small frames, and Tista hung these in all the burnt out houses. And for me, this has been the most important exhibition that I've ever done. Thanks. And before you ask any questions, I do want Tista to stand up. And I also want to tell all of you, senior photographers, youngsters, that she's launching her magazine, Communalism Combat, again, middle of this month. And please contribute images on human rights, on environment, as an act of solidarity. And she's right there, and you're all here. Collect your work, give it to her.
Ram, okay, right here. I mean, it's quite unbelievable to see, whatever this modern history we are making. I was just thinking about, you've had a very amazing start in terms of your parents and your education and all that, and gradually how you have managed to, create the space, and truly as an activist. And what really bothers me is that in today's time, we have all the technology, we have so many tools, it's so much easy to do it, social media, blah, blah, and all that. But there's such little involvement as far as photographers are concerned, in the activism space. And, I'd like you to speak about that a little bit because, it's very critical that how the next generation actually does something about it, not just making little stories on Instagram, if you know what I mean,
Well, that's why I just told my story, because I think, everyone has to figure out, and in many ways my story has happened, it's not something I designed or sought to do. It happened by circumstance. I think, if Safdar hadn't been killed, when he was killed and how he was killed, and Sehmat hadn't happened, one doesn't know where one's trajectory would have gone. But that's why I thought I'd just tell you my story, because I think, there are ways, I think a lot of youngsters that I speak to are confused about, especially now when photography has become so, in a sense, easy. I grew up, we couldn't buy cameras in Delhi and film. I grew up in a situation where that was very, very difficult. You're in a completely different situation now. But I do find that youngsters are, a little confused about where their work is going or why they're doing the work. And I think you just have to figure out your own journey. And I think, maybe there is a way of doing it on social media also. I mean, you don't have to hit the streets. But you just have to basically figure it out. And I think, I've been lucky in the sense of, working with people like Romila Thapar or Tista or, who are either activists or historians. And a lot of that has happened because of Sehmat, because that has, as you well know, because you've been part of that. That's given a space, a platform for that kind of interaction to happen. But that's, that's a chance thing. I mean, I don't think there's any one path.
Ram and I have lived together for many, many, many years.
In different flats, though.
Yes, thank you for clarifying. And this is not a question, but just a remark that, though we lived together for so many years, we just had fleeting, we never really spoke. never had any conversations except the hellos and the byes and how are you doing. But thank you so much for this marvelous talk and for sharing your story. I had a great idea about your history and where you were coming from, but what you've shared today, thank you so much.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you.
Hello,
Hi. Also identify yourself because I'd love to know your names.
I'm Astha. I see you incorporate a lot of theatre, photography, and other art forms, of course, Bharatnatyam. But photography does take a dominant part in your life history that I see. How about other art forms? Are they still functioning in your life, and do you still practice theatre? And what is also Sehmat about? I wanted to know about. What kind of a publication is it?
Well, Sehmat is it's a very informal group. Now, we are all much older, and with people like Shamshad passing away last week, some of us are now beginning to, go into another dimension. But basically, it's, we have used the performing arts. I used is the wrong word. We have worked with performing artists, musicians, but basically, giving a space to people to take a stand on social or political issues without their work necessarily being social or political. So if a Ravi Shankar came and played on the stage, he was just playing his classical music. It wasn't, its content was not social or political, but by being on that platform, he was, as a person, taking a stand through his art. So we've tried to do, we've done exhibition works, we've done video, we've done a lot of publications. I mean, you saw, for instance, this book released yesterday, the Pansare and Kalburgi and Dhabolkar, was put together in literally about 10 days through the families. And in 10 days we got work translated. It's in English. But, that was a statement that, you're not going to squash the voice of these people. So that's the kind of thing that we try to do, which is a kind of intervention, which is hopefully a creative intervention, because we're not politicians. Well, all those aspects run through. I mean, I don't dance. I mean, I dance only at parties nowadays. No, I don't do my Jatiswarams and Tilanas any longer. But I do creative versions of them, if the music is good. Interactions, though, all the time with theatre people, musicians, partly through Sehmat. For instance, in December, beginning of December, we are doing our first event in Bombay at the Times Literary Festival, which I was quite surprised that the Times of India asked us, because 17 years we have not been able to do anything in Bombay because everybody was afraid of the Shiv Sena. And after 17 years, they asked us to do something. So many of you are going to get an email. I was waiting for this talk to be over because I finished putting this together at 2 o'clock, by the way, today. Tomorrow you'll get emails for the project that we're doing, which is the 4th, 5th, 6th of December in Bombay, to which you all have to make some creative work. But I'll go and figure out the size tonight and exactly what we're going to do. But it's going to be some sort of a tent event.
This is regarding, I guess, mainly your documentary photography, but I guess it applies to everything. I guess a lot of your images take on a different significance or a different meaning years after the fact. And I was wondering how, as a photographer, how you interact with the history and the archives of your own work. Like, how, do you look back through your work often, or is it, or does an image just pop in your mind when it's triggered, by something you see or hear? So what is that relationship for you?
Well, actually, both of those things happen. You should also look, Chandan didn't mention, but he had said to me he was going to mention my Facebook posts. My posts are public. You don't have to befriend me, and please don't send any friend requests because I don't look at those friend requests. But you can go and see my album, and you'll see a lot of, I'll be going through photographs, and I'll suddenly see something, and I'll put it on Facebook. I say, okay. In a way, it's a way of making a public archive, because I can actually access it quite easily from there again, instead of keeping it on some hard drive or even in an album. But, for instance, when Shamshad passed away last week, it was suddenly, you're in this horrible situation of trying to think back of the images that you've made over many years of someone like that. And, he was only 69. It wasn't, he was sort of slowly killing himself with smoking and drinking, but still, when it happens, it's a shock. So in some ways, that goads you to pull out images, because now, as I said, the meaning of that image has completely changed with that event happening. Or that image I showed you of Ruth Chhabwala and Cyrus. She was an extremely private person, but somebody that I had grown up with, and she lived up the street from me, so I would walk over on Civil Lines. And I did those pictures, and I never showed those pictures publicly because that was not, they were family pictures. But then when Ruth died, I did put it out on Facebook, and Siddharth, who was editing The Hindu then, called me up and said, can we run it on the front page of The Hindu? And I said, yes, run it, because it's a tribute to Ruth. So, those are complicated. The archive I have at home is vast because I have my parents, both my parents, which are pretty giant archives, which only few traces have come out.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ram.